All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I feel like I should yell and get more people to come in from the outside. I'm really excited about this panel because this is like the issue of our time. And also we have an esteemed panel of experts, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But my name is Gabe Klein. I'm a partner at CityFi, which is an advisory consultancy, a national consultancy. But I'm also the former chief of the Chicago and Washington, D.C. Departments of Transportation. And I was reflecting as I was getting ready for this panel that I put in the first curbside charging station in the United States in Washington, D.C. in 2010. And it's still the only one in Washington, D.C. 12 years later. So that tells you something about this idea of reaching a tipping point. I also personally have an electric car, 2 electric bikes, an electric cargo bike for my kids. And I think all of us have a desire to leave a cleaner, safer world than we have now. And so I just want to set the stage quickly from a macro standpoint. A lot of the panels yesterday touched on this, but we have some pretty incredible environmental challenges ahead, mostly due to a sort of happenstance decision 100 years ago to embrace fossil fuels over steam and electric and other things. We sort of fell into this. So now here we are in 2022, and we face this daunting task of trying to clean up the mess we've created, and we have to do it really quickly. But what's exciting, what's scary, and then also exciting, is we have this critical convergence right now of private sector ingenuity, institutional investment at a large scale. We have a federal government that's really investing heavily in R&D, but also addressing market failures where institutional investors maybe won't take the risk. And there's funding now, as there has been in the past for other types of major improvements, for public and private to come together. And let's be honest, the private sector is going to do a lot of the fulfillment, right, for the actual charging systems and vehicles. So one thing I do want to point out, though, it could be the president, it could be governors, everybody talks about everybody going out and buying an electric car. Like, that's our solution. Everybody's going to go out and buy an electric car. But for those of you that are urban planners or environmentalists, you know that leads to environmental disaster. It's sort of a fallacy, right, that we can all just switch over to electric. People like that idea because it makes it easy. I just trade in this car for that car. The reality is, if you look at like the numbers, we've got to cut 50% of the vehicles on the road to meet the Paris climate numbers. That's if they're all electric. So some of these poor urban planning decisions we made in the past, the sprawling suburbs, I can see Senator Brandis is getting fired up. He's going to argue with me about this. But, we have 30% of car trips less than a mile taken, or of trips in urban areas taken by car, right? And we have an obesity problem. So instead of rattling on, we're going to talk to these smart folks. And we do have an esteemed panel today to address these issues, ranging from fintech entrepreneurs, utilities, the mobility team from the utility here, electeds, and national experts. So let's sit down and meet Jeff, Anuj, André, and Rebecca. And if you guys could introduce yourselves and then talk about sort of what your role is in this critical juncture in time.
Start? Perfect, thanks. State Senator Jeff Brandis. I represent the middle portion of Pinellas County. I've been doing the Florida Senate for a decade. We were kind of on the scene early on automation, and we're the second state in the country, based on some legislation I passed back in 2011, to work on self-driving. Our team helped bring Uber and Lyft to Florida almost a decade ago now. It took us 4 years to fight that battle. We've been working on scooters and e-bikes and all of the other kind of mobility challenges, and really have placed Florida as a forefront in the country in a lot of the discussions on how to solve some of these tough problems. I'm a libertarian that has to identify as a Republican, so it makes me a very odd person even amongst my own party in Tallahassee. But I think if you look at how we've tried to deal with many of these issues in Florida, I kind of go back to how would Milton Friedman have dealt with automated vehicles, electric cars, and all of these other challenges that we're dealing with. And so that's kind of the lens I hold up things to. And there's a reason that Florida regulates EVs and AVs and Ubers in a very similar way. Is we set an insurance amount and we let the market figure it out. So I'm excited to be part of this conversation. Probably have a little different take on electrification, but also an EV owner. So not because because I wanted not only to be a member, the president of the Hair Club, but also a member.
Well put.
That's great. Yeah, my name is Anuj Chokshi. I'm the director of e-mobility at Florida Power and Light. I am responsible for the execution and deployment of infrastructure statewide, EV infrastructure statewide. Definitely very excited to be here. I'm also an EV driver. I think that's how you get on the board here. And it's an exciting time for EVs, and I'm really happy and excited to share some of our thoughts about EVs. I don't know, I think many of you guys are from Florida, but I know many of you guys are also not from Florida. And within Florida, right, over the last couple of years, we've seen an amazing expansion of EVs, right? Over the past 5 years, it's almost been 300%. Florida's now become the #2 state in the nation for electric vehicles. And so, my role is to help, further that adoption, even though, we're the second largest state. That only represents about 5% of the total registrations in the state. And so our activities within FPL are to help advance electrification throughout the state.
Thanks. I'm André. I work at McKinsey, where I work for the McKinsey Global Institute as one of the things I do. I also have the great privilege of having had the foresight to move to Miami before the pandemic, and I lead our McKinsey office here in Miami. And one of the things I sort of want to maybe talk about and frame today is, as we talk about electrification, we should talk about it in the context of the overall path to net zero. And recognizing that there are sort of 7 large systems which we need to tackle, including power, industrial, and mobility is one of them, which get us there. And if anyone has read that report, what it basically shows is an estimate, which is an alarmingly high figure of needing to invest globally around $9 trillion a year for the next 30 years to get to net zero. Now, that's an extraordinarily large portion of GDP as well. But it is a way to frame the problem and to show the complexity and the comprehensive partnership that's going to be required and the ingenuity required to get us on that path.
And the political requirement.
Indeed.
Great. So I'm Rebecca Saletta, representing a startup called Zeddy. So based out of Los Angeles, but we're a London-based fintech startup. So really looking at different financing models to increase ZEV adoption. So what are we doing as vehicles transition in the state? What are the different ways that we can do this? So what Zeddy does essentially is a quick high level. It's a different kind of model, but we're looking at taking institutional capital, so green funding, ESG, and deploying that into fleets of clean and connected vehicles. We work with fleet operators and EV OEMs. We can kind of cross a lot of areas here. We're talking light duty fleets, medium duty, and heavy duty. As a fintech, you're able to kind of sit outside the picture and really look at, where are the needs, who's ready to deploy, how are we actually going to overcome the cost barrier of these goals that we've set for ourselves. And so I come to Zeddy from actually a background with the UK government, so from the public sector, working across the west coast of the US, building out kind of EV strategy. And so really jumping to a startup in this place is a really interesting way you kind of look about dealing with the public sector and the private sector with similar goals. And how do you, as a startup, navigate this scene in a way that's bringing innovation into structures that are already in place. You're looking at traditional financing models, but then bringing in new ideas to help this roll out in the most efficient way possible. So that's kind of how I fit into the picture.
Awesome. So with that in mind, what you've all stated, I think the first question I'd like to ask is, the next 36 months are so critical, right? We have federal administration's making a $12.5 billion investment. Really, if you look at all the funding streams, up to $100 billion, potentially. there are a lot of challenges. As you said, Andre, there's 7 interconnected systems that you have to align to get this to work. And you've got, regional politics, national politics, international. You have standards. What do you guys think are in the next 36 months, the biggest challenges to getting this done, to hitting this tipping point, and maybe the biggest opportunities? And who wants to start? Senator Brandis?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is you're likely going to have a change of the federal administration coming up here. And
Maybe.
well, okay. Serious maybe, but it's likely to happen. And if that occurs, then obviously the whole perspective is going to shift. And there could be some shift of pulling back dollars. Obviously, states that are more red are having, they don't know where they're going to spend Biden bucks on some of these issues, or they're hesitant to spend them because they don't want to be seen as too far to the left. So there's some hesitancy in this discussion, but I think that the real challenge is if the federal government just provided it as a block grant, then the states would move on and do things. But it's the strings attached, and the strings are still being discussed, and the new strings are being added. And I think the federal government has not done the simple thing, like let people charge at rest stops, which is currently federally prohibited, and allow some of those dollars to be spent at rest stops to add vehicle charging infrastructure there. So I think we have failed to do the simple things. We don't know what the strings are to some of the other dollars, and the whole game could change here in 24 months.
No, it's true. Just a note that they're working to change the NHS rules, National Highway System, to allow, it's an advertising ban, basically, that keeps the electric charging stations. But there's 2 types of charging. There's the community-based charging grants, which are, urban cities, and then there's the highway charging. And they are really 2 totally different situations. But we need Republicans and Democrats to get on board with that shift.
Yeah, I think, kind of simple answer there is, definitely formalizing these plans and the requirements and ensuring that, these dollars get spent. I think we saw, some examples with VW funding and the efficiencies there. I think that there's definitely an opportunity because of the larger dollar values that are tagged to the federal funding, that those plans have to be established. And I also believe that, collaboration is key in these areas, right? FPL in the past, we've partnered with FDOT, public, private, different sectors. I think, all of these different entities are going to be critical to ensuring the success. I definitely like the rest stop. I applaud that as well as opening those areas, because I think those corridors are key.
Well, and it's so important for business, freight, fleets, and consumer to get those rest stops lit up.
Well, I might take just 2 different angles here on your biggest risks. The first one I would say is, I think, let's take at the city level, there's a risk that we think of electrification as the goal rather than integrated and improved consumer mobility in a world in which we'd like fewer emissions, right? So that obviously means what kind of mobility do people need? How do we make sure that mobility needs are being met in an equitable fashion? What infrastructure do we need? What's the role of micro-mobility? In other words, a much more comprehensive view than a electrification view, because that might lead us down the path to some unintended consequences. So that's kind of one risk. I think the other, let me now zoom way out. We've done some work which has projections which shows that kind of in a middle case, EV adoption in the EU, US, and China by 2030 will be 120 million vehicles. And at the more aggressive case, it could be 240 million vehicles. So what are consumers telling us? They're telling us that the 3 biggest barriers to adoption are 1, price, 2, driving range, and 3 is access to efficient charging stations. So there's a real risk that EV adoption gets out ahead of have we provided the infrastructure that people need, even if the price and driving range issues are addressed. So I think, Gabe, that'd be the 2 things I would say.
Great. Thank you.
I think I'm excited to take a little bit of a startup perspective to this, because the risk for me is, maybe off of Anuj's point, is a failure to collaborate across the public and private sectors. We have ideas across the board, and I think, as a startup trying to navigate these goals across sectors, it's faster if you move with the private sector. If you partner up in the private sector, then you cruise, but then you launch things into cities before they're ready, or you fail to do the due diligence or hold the responsibility of saying, here's an idea, I'm going to take the time to socialize, I'm going to take the time to get into the right circles and groups, and it's hard, it's challenging. There's silos that are in place from this, and I think a risk would be, to not hold that with responsibility. And I think, for us, we can help deploy fleets across the private and the public sector, right? So it's going to move faster with a private fleet that says, great, we want to adopt 10 electric vehicles. Can you finance this? That's great. We pull some funding out, we get the vehicles out. You say, okay, city of LA, or that's where I'm from, but you look across at cities across the board and there's excitement on it, but there's also a challenge. There's a lot of kind of just stepping through different hurdles of saying, here, let me explain a new idea here. And it's great, but it's like we're getting more receptive to it now. And I think that's our challenge, is how can we remain receptive to this? Because if we're trying to solve a problem, I think there's also responsibility and a risk in pretending that you know how to solve everything. And I think there's something of a responsibility in admitting, saying, here's what we're trying to do. Does this work? Hitting pause for a minute, saying, does this work for you? Let's run it back. Let's look at it a little bit closer. Let's apply it to this type of vehicle or this type of fleet. Let's apply it to hydrogen. I know it's electrification panel, but really across the board, how does it work? How do we solve that? And I think, that's the opportunity at the same time, is being able to pull that together in a more collaborative way.
I totally agree. I mean, we sometimes in our own minds, or you even sort of read about it, we sort of pit public versus private, and it doesn't need to be that way. I mean, the book I wrote, Startup City, was basically about that, how the two can collaborate, co-create, basically, particularly with these complex solutions that are needed, co-create the future, and make it context sensitive. So we were just talking about, the urban need. Like, I think we all agree on the highway. I don't know anybody that doesn't agree that we need to light up the national highway system, and really other highways as well with charging. I think everybody agrees, left, right, center. When you get into the urban context, it gets a little more complex. And like, are you going to light up the curbside? Are you just going to do off-street and garages? Are you going to do mobility hubs? Are you going to do multimodal charging? And then one of the most important things, to the point that I made opening up, are we going to try to facilitate everybody going out and buying a vehicle, which for low-income people creates a tremendous problem for them, right? We have people like in Southeast DC spending up to 53% of their income on transportation. So how do we facilitate these? There's a lot of cool private sector companies springing up, either that want to finance the entire thing for like a building, right? So you get the chargers, you get the vehicles, you get the service and the maintenance, or for an entire city or a region. I was talking to a senior government official who was lamenting the other day that, we're putting out 500,000 chargers. For the ones going to cities, every single one should have a car with it, or a vehicle with it. So what do you guys think about the urban context and problem, and how we should address that, whether it's from the financial perspective, the planning perspective, strategy, utility?
Yeah, no, I can definitely, at least begin there. I think, that's definitely an important segment, right? To your point, a lot of the focus on fast charging and in the private sector is looking at areas where there's higher utilization, right? And kind of overlooking some of the urban underserved areas that are there, or the metropolitan areas as well.
Or the Ubers and Lyfts that need to charge.
Exactly, right? You need that pathway for that, right? So, one way that we're looking at it, right, is to create urban fast charge centers, right? We want to make sure that everybody has equitable access to fast charging, even if they're not in areas or have easy access to charging, right? So if you're in a multi-dwelling unit, you may not have access, the same access as somebody maybe like in a residential home, right? So deploying these urban charging stations in these metropolitan areas or underserved areas kind of ensures that, people that don't necessarily have access to charging can have access to charging. The same applies, we're a hurricane state in Florida, right? So the same applies to evacuation routes, right? And you talked a little bit about what are some of the opportunities with some of this funding and things like that are coming down. The role that we could potentially play there, or that we should play, is in both of these areas, right? Urban areas, underserved areas, as well as evacuation zones within the state.
Anybody else?
I was just going to jump in real quick on the utilization point, because I think that's part of this is, and again, so part of our model is the per mile financing. So looking at paying for things as you use them, which I think as you're looking at different areas, that gives you a lot of flexibility into bringing these technologies into spaces if you're not paying all of the upfront costs for it. You're paying it as you use it, or you can do that per kilowatt hour if you're looking at charging. So that kind of creates a new space with a little bit more freedom there, as far as knowing how much you're going to be able to use something, and that total cost of ownership is a huge barrier. So I think kind of part of that's what we're trying to tackle is as you apply this across different areas, and it doesn't just work in cities, like, we're focusing on fleets, of course, but really it comes down to how much are you using these assets and that kind of total cost. And so I think as you free up the ability to kind of optimize that and use things to their efficiency, I think that is really helpful as you're looking at other kind of, city models.
Well, I think the key is 80% of charging happens at home. So how are we ensuring that people have charging at home? And how are the issues of equity where they live in an apartment complex? Because if somebody has a home, yeah, you can you can drop a charger in for $500. Yep. But if you live in an apartment complex, it makes the whole complicated, formula a lot more challenging. So, I think that's the role for the cities and states to be involved, at least on the front end right now, saying, hey, if you're going to build a new apartment complex, at least stub out for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So, but I think we've got to address the 80% problem, and then we can address the 20% problem, because, again, 80% of people are, need a place to charge in their, where they're going to be parking their car overnight. And we need to be solving and focusing on that issue.
And they don't need level 3 charging. In fact, the Blink CEO, I think, was talking about this, that the mix is really important. We think that we got to put in level 3 chargers everywhere, which makes it sort of an insurmountable problem, even for the grid. But really, it's probably 80% level 2.
Absolutely. I mean, I think for the most part, what you need is trickle charging and then the ability to fast charge on key nodes, which is why rest stops become so important. Which is why most of your gas stations are having a conversation about adding EV charging in to their mix right now anyways. So I think that transition you're going to see take place.
Yeah, I might just add the sort of consumer perspective, because you mentioned affordability and equity, and I think that's pretty important. We've been doing some work on how are consumers in America feeling right now, and two things are going on. One is they say that values are very important in their purchase decisions, so ESG type concerns, including electric, things like that. Now, we suddenly find ourselves in a world in which we've got 8.5% inflation, and now consumers are telling us, I want value over values, unfortunately. Yep. And that's a reality. So, because what I would say is we are really tracking consumer sentiment about economic opportunity. And what it's telling us is that the real economy is now diverging from the perception economy. So what do I mean by that? Unemployment is way down, GDP growth is way up, wage growth is up, and yet Americans are telling us, and we just got some results from 25,000 Americans, which say that they feel worse economically than a year ago. They feel there are fewer opportunities for them, their family, and the country. Okay, so that's now this new environment we're operating in, and that's going to influence, that's a new headwind when you think about making decisions where you say, in order to contribute by buying an EV, I've now got this headwind of affordability and my feeling that there's economic issues.
Well, thus what Senator Brandis said about the likely switch in administration, which is probably true, unless inflation comes back down and people feel better, right? So let's talk about this idea of a tipping point. So people think, well, it's been so gradual so far that it's probably going to continue to be gradual, right? Let's see what happens by 2030. But then you have people like Elon Musk, everybody's favorite villain, who says, look, I'm going to allow everybody to turn on sharing of their vehicles if you own a Tesla, which I do. And then basically you turn your owned vehicle, that's been your private vehicle, into a business, right? And so if something like that happens, you could see a sea change sort of potentially overnight, right? And commercialization of service. For the mobility space, for those of you that are in the mobility space, that means that car sharing, ride hailing, a lot of things just become the same thing, right? Because it's autonomous potentially, it's electric, and it just takes you where you need to go. The commoditization of that type of transportation for those use cases. Do you guys have thoughts on either, my perspective there, whether it's likely or not, and whether you think that this tipping point will continue to be gradual, like it was with the cell phone and the smartphone, right? For 20 years it was coming, and then boom, overnight, it just exploded finally. What do you think?
Well, I think, so if you read Ernest Hemingway's book, The Sun Also Rises, there's a line in there about going broke, and he said, how'd you go broke? And he said, gradually and then all at once. And so what ends up happening here, I think, is we need to be thinking about the tertiary effects of EVs as well. For example, in auto dealerships, 60% of their revenue is service, 40% is sales. Well, EVs need, 1/3 the service? So it's going to have a major effect. As, gas stations that are barely profitable, I can't tell you the last time I went to a gas station, although I was driving my wife's car. So, those gas stations that are barely profitable are going to fall away. Your Pep Boys, your other service industry, Midases, those types of things. There's going to be drastic changes. What are the things that need to be changed in an EV? Windshield wipers and tires, right? And so that's just a different market that's going to have a very dramatic effect. But also we need to be thinking about, all right, if everybody's owning an EV, Florida's a tourist economy, 130 million tourists a year. How are we working with our Hotel Restaurant Lodging Association to ensure that we have EV charging in all of our restaurants and hotels? So we need to be thinking much more about the secondary effects of this versus just where my primary ownership going to be, because Hertz just went out and bought a ton of EVs, or is shifting to a ton of EVs. But then the question is, well, where the heck are these customers going to charge them if they're staying in hotels most nights? There isn't a lot of options.
Yeah, I think there definitely is, an inflection point, right? I'm not sure the exact timing of it, right? The forecasts that we use, which are sort of the industry forecasts, look at 2030 and 25% of EVs, being, or 25% of vehicles being electric by 2030. I think that that's sort of what our forecasts show. I think there's going to be an inflection point. I think key to that is infrastructure, right? Removing some of those barriers to adoption, whether it's in the home or along the highway, whatever it may be. I think those are all things that are going to be contributory there. And once people see and recognize, and there's more vehicles, battery costs come down, more vehicles are available, they're more affordable. That's when we'll actually start to see that inflection point. Until then, it's more of the flat screen model that we kind of saw with televisions.
I think I'm thinking about this from the financial perspective again. So, imagining that the supply chain was perfect and all these EVs were, outside right now. Until I think the tipping point is going to come when we can free up the financing to do it. I think there's government funding, there's state funding, which is brilliant, and it's wonderful the amount of money that we are pouring into this. But is it enough? I think that's kind of where is the tipping point at that point is, kind of where we're sitting is how can you really deploy these vehicles more efficiently by getting new capital into this so that we can actually fund these things and get them out there. And something that we're playing around with is when you look at kind of how do you marry those two, right? How do you pull in this grant funding, which traditionally is kind of more siloed, but then how do you marry that with, maybe green investment? And how does that work? These don't traditionally sit together. But for example, if you get, a check to go purchase, one, fine, okay, we'll give it 10 clean vehicles. If you get a check for that, that's great, and there's 10 vehicles. But if you spread that check across 20 vehicles and you finance that middle portion, have 20 vehicles out on the market, you're only paying, a cost per mile, because where we sit again would be that cost per mile bit. So the cost of your vehicles have just gone down incredibly. You've got twice as many vehicles on the road, and you've matched the state funding or whatever public funding there is with a financial model that helps stretch it out. And to me, that if you can get that flow going, then you're deploying way more vehicles in efficient ways. And again, the point is to your original point. It's not that we want to flood the world, but as we transition these vehicles over, how are we transitioning as many as possible?
I think I'm probably with Senator Brandis. I don't think there's a tipping point. I think it's easier in fully digital systems to have tipping points and network effects. But here we've got kind of vehicle replacement cycles. Mm-hmm. We've got issues on the supply side, the simplest one of being scaling up of batteries, and even just thinking now about supply of the various components and elements that go into battery, and we're seeing all sorts of growing pains there. And then in addition to that, you've got all the charging infrastructure, and then in addition to that, you've got a question of to what extent can some of the major car manufacturers and other vehicle manufacturers ramp up their production. And you look across the board at startups in more on the trucking side and other side, and what you see is delays, bigger challenges, supply problems. That just tells me this is a steady improvement, and at some point each year you see further and further penetration, but I'm more inclined to that view.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a bummer, but hey, it may be true. It probably is. So you talked about net zero, André, getting to net zero. We have FPL here, and I'm sure everybody has thoughts on this, but can we talk about the energy side, the renewable production side, and how that ties into where we need to go? Like, are there people think that there's limitations on the grid, particularly if we need so many level 3 chargers. Now you guys at FPL, you have a parent company that's national, right? And you guys seem to be doing things differently, at least than my utility in DC, that's for sure. So could you talk a little bit about your approach and your parent company's approach to the renewable energy side and how that ties in?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So our parent company is Nextera Energy, and there's 2 subsidiaries. There's Nextera Energy Resources, which is the unregulated side, which is nationwide, and then there's Florida Power and Light. And in terms of renewables, right, the parent company Nextera Energy, we're the largest producer of wind and solar in the world from that perspective, right? And we've always had a very sustainable and renewables focus. Within Florida Power and Light, when we look at, our role in this space, right, it's to build infrastructure, and it's to ensure that we have the highest reliability and to maintain that reliability, right? And so we have one of the most advanced grids in the entire country. Our reliability numbers show that we're around like 99.9%, reliability or something to that effect. And so when we talk about congestions and things like that often come up with electric vehicles and charging infrastructure coming on the grid, that's not necessarily a focus area or a problem area that we're trying to solve for. We've already installed over 700 fast charge ports with Tesla, Electrify America, ourselves, EVgo, and we've done that, flawlessly. There's definitely been studies and things that we've done along the way to help improve our ability to deploy this infrastructure in terms of transformers and dedicated transformers and higher K-factor ratings to ensure there's no power quality and harmonic issues that could, adversely affect our customers. So from that perspective, it's not an area of focus. What we're heavily focused on is infrastructure build out, and what makes us different is the cohesive approach that we're taking to this infrastructure. About 3 years ago, 2019, we launched a pilot called FPL Evolution, where we deployed about 1,000 charge ports throughout our state to remove those barriers that we talked about as it relates to adoption. And as part of last year's settlement agreement, we had $175 million of programs to deploy additional infrastructure. $100 million of that is around public infrastructure, both on highways as well as these urban areas that we talked about. And then in addition to that, as part of that, right, the other $75 million, we're focused on FPL Evolution Home, which is a monthly service that we provide at a monthly fee where we'll come and install a home charger, and will allow folks to charge unlimited during off-peak hours, right? And that also helps with grid resiliency from that perspective. And then the last area is around fleets, right? And we have a fleet tariff, which I won't get into, but it's their focus to incent fleets to electrify. And that's sort of maybe the slowest segment that is in the state right now, and maybe one of the greater challenges looking forward in terms of electrification.
Anyone else have thoughts on the renewable side? No?
I think the story of renewables is really the story of batteries, and how the battery technology is going to play as far as your ability to store that energy. Florida generates a ton of, there's obviously a ton of sunlight. We have a ton of solar capacity. We use most of our energy in the summer for air conditioning. And we have a ton of excess capacity in the winter where we don't have everybody running their air conditioners. I actually think the story of Florida is actually we're going to be generating water through desalination during the winter to use this excess capacity and energy, because we can store water really inexpensively, and then utilizing that during the summer when we need the excess capacity for air conditioning. So We're going to be an air conditioning state in generating air conditioning in the summer and water in the winter.
That is really interesting. You have a very interesting perspective as a Republican, a libertarian, but you seem to be very pro-environment, electric, right?
I mean, I think this is the direction that we're headed, right? I think even Republicans, Democrats, everybody sees this is a major issue that they want to be on board with. But I think it isn't like Republicans just want to, find coal and burn coal. This is a cost-effective way to move forward here, and this is the direction people are going. One, because it's going to be cheaper over the long term on a cost per mile basis to operate an EV,
right?
And so people vote with their pocketbooks. And this is the direction everything's heading. They don't want to spend a ton of money in maintenance. They don't want to spend a ton of money in fuel. They would like to go out and have 280 miles every time they unplug from their garage and have that flexibility. Plus, they like the ability to, I think the biggest opportunity in vehicles right now are beyond electrification is over-the-air software updates. And that is a game changer. That until you own a car that has over-the-air software updates, you don't recognize. But when you combine EVs, I think the interesting thing for me is as vehicles get more shared, it makes more sense for them to be more electric. And as you see more shared in electric vehicles, it makes more sense for them to be automated so you can get that cost per passenger mile down. And so as each one of those grows, it makes more sense for, as you have more shared economy, it makes more sense for them to be electrified. And then it makes more sense to them to be automated so those assets can be utilized more effectively. Yeah,
I totally agree. And there's a gentleman I was talking to last night from MIT. He's got a panel at 4 o'clock, and he's an urbanist, but he's going to be talking about how the data shows him that people want to own their own vehicles, right? That Americans like to own their own vehicles. But you guys have both brought up value, and that trumps values. And I saw that at Zipcar, where when we could give people a car for $8.50 an hour, everything loaded in, insurance, depreciation, they were like, it's too good not to do it, right? People are inherently sort of selfish around dollars, as they should be, maybe. So what is the business model of the future? Why aren't we seeing more of this package, whether it's the vehicle and the car for private ownership or services? I mean, there's rumors that Apple's going to be introducing a vehicle that you'll be able to get with your Apple One subscription. Amazon's looking at the same thing with Prime. Do you guys think that that's where things are going to go, particularly in maybe urban and urbanizing suburban areas, or is it a pipe dream?
No, I think transportation as a service is definitely going to be real. Once the technology and the autonomous vehicles, when people deem that safe and it's omnipresent, I think it's definitely going to be a game changer, in this industry.
I mean, I'm also team transportation as a service. Just in general, it's more efficient that way as well. I think we're looking at, a really big problem, and the more creative we can get, the more collaborative we can get in that space, the better. So as kind of transportation transitions that way, you bring more parties into one space, which is the challenge, right? You're pulling a lot of people together to do transportation as a service at all. But I think there's so much energy from all the corners. There's energy from utilities, there's energy from infrastructure, there's energy from the OEMs, just to look at that. And I think if that syncs up, you end up being able to roll out something that actually works. And I think we're in that phase right now where we're brainstorming it, but I do think the pursuit of transportation as a service is going to be the direction we're heading in. At least that's what I'm looking at.
Although the OEMs are a little nervous. They've all dabbled in this, but they're like, shit, if this really happens, we're going to have a lot fewer vehicles sold, and there's going to be winners and losers, right? Some companies are going to have to go away.
Yeah, I think I go back to, in the future, do brands matter? Right, when Foxconn's producing a vehicle, and I use this example, when I get in my Uber, right, I don't care what brand that Uber is, if it's an X. I care if it's a black, I want it to be a black car, and I want it to have the features of a black car.
Sure.
But in the future, as we move towards electrification, and all cars can go really fast, and all cars have great acceleration, and we're really just talking about the interior features maybe versus the how it drives. I think that we move to this world where brands matter less, and if we're buying vehicles if we're buying transportation by the mile, then we go to potentially generic car.
Right.
And I think that's an interesting future to think about, understanding that future is likely to be shared, electric, and automated.
Right, because it might matter more, are you an Apple person or a Samsung person or an Amazon person,
You'll have
right?
a subscription, right? So I might
Right.
subscribe to Mercedes if I want the high-end experience, or I might be,
Yep.
I'm the Amazon Prime member, and I'm
Right.
paying $99 a month, and I have access to this vehicle for $1, for 25 cents a mile.
Right, like music, right? I have Apple Music. My friends have Spotify. Somebody else has Pandora. I'm only going to pay for one.
But I do think Americans will still own one car,
Okay.
but not the fourth car,
Yeah.
and maybe not the third car.
Yep, great point. Andre?
What a great question. I mean, we do have transportation as a service. It's called public transportation.
Great point.
And
But it's not a good service.
well, but
Also a great point.
But that's the key point. It comes down to really understanding what is it that people value in their transportation. So if it's difficult to get to, if it doesn't run regularly enough, and you can imagine all these same problems being the case if you have the newer versions of transportation as a service. How long does it take a car to get to my house, right? What is, so there are all sorts of reasons why you can imagine that should or shouldn't work. And it could be very variable in different urban areas. Let's take New York City right now, where I spend a lot of time. 30 or 40% more people are driving cars in New York City right now. Why? Because they perceive the subway to be unsafe. So there are, I think, really complex local factors that will determine what modes of transportation will take off. And then, by the way, here we have a different problem in Florida. For anyone who's been here for a couple of years, it takes longer to get around. So do we have an integrated view of what's happening to population? Do we know where people are going to live? How are we going to solve the housing affordability question? And how are transportation modalities going to be fit around where people are? What does that mean for how many roads? There's a whole set of
But that's why you and I exist, to solve all those problems.
Yeah, which is why I think, again, the transportation as a service thing, it's a tactic or a solution within the context of 7 or 8 million people living in an urban area who need a problem solved. And what are all the other issues that need to be resolved in some integrated fashion?
So back in Pinellas County, where I live, I asked my local transit agency a question. I said, well, if we shut off 1 hour earlier, if we stop busing 1 hour earlier, how many Uber and Lyft drives could I provide as a voucher to people? And it turns out it was literally probably 3 times the amount of people that were actually riding the bus during that hour. And so what we said was, well, we can actually provide them this service all night long and get people. So we have a third shift, kind of a third shift service now. We will take you directly from your house to your job and home. And it was cheaper to do that than it was to provide that last hour of busing.
And there's such an interesting tension here, because you're right. And you're also right that public transit has been often designed in the US as a social service, right? You go to, really any other country? And it's like night and day. I was in Stockholm, and the bus comes every 3 minutes. It's run by the private sector, right? It's run by Transdev. It's amazing. And then you have Via, in this country, is doing microtransit, right? Where it's more door to door. You might walk a few blocks. There is going to have to be a reinvention to some extent of transit.
When we've stopped subsidizing the transit operator and we start subsidizing the individual who needs help,
Yes.
that's the paradigm shift that has to occur.
I just wrote about this. I was like, we have to. I can't believe how much I'm agreeing with this guy. This is amazing. Maybe I'm a libertarian. No, I'm just kidding. No, but seriously, it's so true, because you can fund the user. You design an amazing system, right? And then you fund on a sliding scale the people that need it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And
I
do that.
totally agree.
So if you do that for electrification, if you do that for transportation and mobility, you do it for housing, it changes the paradigm and how you think about this.
Yeah.
And I know we've shifted far away from electrification.
That's okay.
But I think, the key is, that's the paradigm shift that I think needs to occur, that changes the model, that allows a lot of these other things to begin to then shift, and changes the adoption patterns.
Yep. I think you're right. Would people like to ask some questions? Because we have 2 mics. We've been talking a lot. You're welcome to ask. You can jump up and go. Vivian, you want to ask a question? No? City 5 people? Anybody?
This guy's asking over here.
Oh, great. All right.
I don't have to say who I am. Do I have anonymity? Yeah.
It's probably okay.
Okay. I'm a traffic engineer over time.
I would be anonymous too. I totally get it.
I know. So, ladies, I know it's irresistible, but it's not. Control yourselves. What? I've also been a transit operator, so when I heard the discussion about we could ship them off and use Uber, but as my traffic side was, depending on when that happens, that could be a really bad idea because if a bus carries even 20 people or 10 people, it's 20 times more cars during the highest peak hour. So I think that thought has to be put into it. So my question is, what do you all suggest we should be looking at as traffic engineers and maybe transit operators together? How do we solve that bit?
So I meant to respond that way, and I apologize to you and everybody because
you just rolled over though.
I did. I totally rolled over. No, but it's true. You have to measure the full societal negative or positive impact, right? You can't just look at is it better. What I meant to say is when I said there's a tension, it's between serving the customer as best as you can to get them where they need to go as fast as humanly possible or reliably, and then what are the emissions, right? What are the health impacts? What is all that? And we have to balance that. We can't just give everybody an Uber if it's bad. But then again, from an equity standpoint, we do need to serve people better than we used to. And the reason I brought up VIA is maybe there's solutions that aren't all one or the other.
And I will applaud the senator for asking the really hard questions repeatedly, and he never backs down. And I mean, I don't always agree with him, but I also know that those are the tough questions that need to be asked during these processes and when you're actually putting money together. So that's my take on it. So actually all of you, the way you've been putting in the input, fantastic. So
Thank you so much.
And my name is Frank, so I'm not anonymous anymore.
No last names though. Frank, the traffic engineer. So do you guys have thoughts on what he was saying in terms of one or the other? Or
Yeah, there's not a right answer. It depends on the community that you're living in, and it's much more complicated than just thinking about mobility. You have to think about, if we're talking about housing affordability, the number one way I can solve this problem is giving you a voucher and letting you live closer to work. And so it's not just a transportation problem, it's a housing problem.
Oh yeah.
And so it's much deeper. When we get to the root of the issue, it's, hey, if I get you closer with your housing, then I don't have to provide that transportation because if I'm putting you in the projects to live, now I've got to solve two problems: where you live and how I get you to and from work and your kids to and from school. Versus if I get you closer to your work, I don't have to solve that second problem, which completely changes the formula for us.
Or if you give people even broadband access where they live.
Correct, right. So I think bottom line is we're in this fascinating time between the lightning and the thunder. We know it's coming. We know we haven't seen it really play out yet, but we know that the thunder is coming. We have to be prepared for it. In the times of uncertainty, what we should focus in on is maximizing our options. There's a reason that we would drive in fog, we slow down, we turn the radio down, and we tell our kids in the back to shut up because we're peering intently out because we don't know what lies ahead. That's kind of where we are in the world of electrification right now.
Sometimes I even do that when there's no fog. I tell them to shut up. Anybody else have any thoughts on this? If not, go ahead.
Well, I'll just add one maybe sobering thought about what's really happening here. Literally, there's been almost no change. People who bought car A, some of them, a very small portion, are now buying car B. Just think about how hard that's been. Meaning the cultural and consumer and way we live factors are so powerful.
Ingrained.
And so difficult to change. And it's taken this long, and literally, if you really say how are people's lives different, the one thing we've asked them to maybe do a little differently is instead of going to the gas station, maybe charge your car, but otherwise they're doing the same stuff. So that's kind of what we're up against, and I think that's sort of sobering when you say, back to your point, where's the tipping point, what really has to happen, and we barely scratch the surface of, let's assume now that everyone in this room gets an EV, well then we really need him to create a lot of renewable energy, otherwise it's a waste of time.
So we're going to have another panel next CoMotion about resilience and impacts
and there's that too.
And mass migrations and all of that, and how do you deal with that? Because if we don't make the change, then you really do get into the reactionary mode of dealing with the impacts. Anybody have any closing thoughts? We have 1 minute and 15 seconds left. Oh, is there another question? Dave Myers, go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Gabe. If you had a magic wand and your goal was to accelerate the adoption of EVs, what one thing would you change with your magic wand?
Me personally, I would,
or anyone on the
or
panel.
anyone, I would make it completely frictionless. I package it all together, and I'd have it like a national program fulfilled by the private sector of chargers, vehicles, multimodal hubs, and do it in 24 months, like a American Job Corps program, like they did with the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s. Public and private coming together to do it. That's me.
Yeah, I'd say it's infrastructure, but I would just say 30% of that would be done by the utility. And the only thing I'll add, kind of reacting to his thoughts, was that with our EVs, 100% of the power for our EV chargers, this is pretty recent, is going to be coming from renewable energy, right? So we have about 50 solar energy centers in Florida, and that's something that I think is going to be important in the future too, as far as where that power comes from will be just as important as delivering that power.
I'm going to answer a different question. I think the number one challenge facing states right now as they're dealing with EV adoption is gas tax and how to deal with the gas tax that EVs don't pay. It is, some states just put a $250 charge on EV registration. I think that's probably the simplest way. I think we're probably decades out from a mileage-based user fee, or over a decade out from a mileage-based user fee because of the complications of privacy and the technology around it.
Do you support a mileage-based user fee?
I think if done in the right way, it's the most libertarian way to think about about it. But I think in the short term, I think a registration fee on electric vehicles is probably the easiest way to deal with it. People don't think about the cost of collection today, and when you're buying and you're paying the gas tax, most people don't even realize you're paying it. They're just paying for gas. And from a state's perspective, we're not collecting it from the gas stations. We're collecting it from the distributors. So we're actually collecting it from like 20 or 30 people, not the thousands of gas stations in the state of Florida. The key is for EV, for a mileage-based user fee, now I go to collecting it from 11 million people. And so it's a really different kind of complicated problem. Now, if MasterCard, Visa, and American Express or Tesla and the OEMs figure out how to do it, then we're only collecting from 30 people again. But there's that privacy issue. But it's the number one issue facing states in the short term. As Florida basically says, we don't subsidize electric vehicles, and I would argue absolutely we subsidize them because we don't charge a gas tax.
Okay. Yeah, very interesting point. We need another panel on that too. Well, we are out of time. Thanks to this awesome group of panelists. And thanks to all of you for coming. Have a great rest of the day.